So good morning, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you once again to another edition of our Boni podcast. In this case, we are going to speak with Katerina Polikonopoulos. Katerina has a Greek name and she has Greek sources, but she is American. She spent most parts of her life in the US. She's a lawyer who received her Juris Doctorate in 2012 from the University of Illinois. And before moving to Vienna, Katerina worked as an associate attorney at several of the large California law firms, where she was involved in quite a lot of the Californian business, including several $million complex construction and government contract disputes. She has a typical US attorney career, outstandingly brilliant, with a background in IT and IP law. And we were lucky enough to convince her that it would be a wise idea to join us in the department at the University of Vienna more than a year ago, and where she is now working in several projects. Katerina, it's so great to have you with us in the team, but it's also really great to have you with us today. How are you? How are you?
Thank you. I'm well. It's a pleasure. And thank you for that very kind introduction.
Thank you, Katerina. So perhaps let's start very easily about how you feel that Austria is doing in this crisis, what you see as being different from what you would have expected with your US background in what we do here in Austria at the moment. Is there anything you find outstandingly interesting?
Well, I mean, it's a very different government system, and we'll discuss that later. Austria being a civil law country and part of Europe, its powers are much more plenary than the federal government of the United States. Again, we'll get into details of that later. Austria was a lot quicker to respond than the federal government has been, and I'm sure that whoever's keeping tabs on the latest responses of President Trump is well aware of the fact that it's taken the federal government quite a long time to make any moves really at all to allocate funding in support of attempting to get medical supplies to states that need them, and in general in declaring a state of emergency. So yeah. Austria is a leg up. So,
yeah, but if you, I don't want to speak already now about the US, but mainly about what you see, for example, how people behave in whether they comply or don't comply with the rules set by the government. Is this,
yeah.
Is there anything you can report, whether this is, or is this just like you would have expected it?
Austrians as a people, I think, are much more willing to listen to, well, they're more diligent, I suppose. And this is, again, it's so dependent from state to state, right? Because you hear these reports of people in Miami going out to the beach and generally being completely unaware of what's going on in the world. And then California is a very stark contrast to that kind of behavior. Californians, and again, you know, Governor Gavin Newsom discussed yesterday potentially reopening or lifting some of the restrictions on movement that California had issued in early March because California is doing so well and successfully flattened the curve. So Californians are much more diligent about abiding by stay-home orders, wearing masks when they're going out in public, wearing gloves. Generally, from what I've just seen from a completely personal point of view, in Austria, people are, you know, more or less the same. Austrians do like to spend a lot of time outdoors. So I have seen quite a bit of bike riding and an attempt to enjoy nature in a way that I'm not sure that Americans have the same sort of cultural expectations of. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that you already emphasized now, which are important in my view, is that from a European perspective, if you are not really familiar with the situation in the US, you see the US as one country with one culture. But when you go into the details, you see very quickly that there are 50 different states and 50 different cultures and 50 different legal systems. So that even an overview about what exactly the legal situation looks like at the moment is very difficult to achieve. And I find it interesting that you already started now to speak about California, because that's your I assume the most important background that you personally have. So could you perhaps go a little bit more into detail in how far the situation in California at the moment is different, for example, from the situation in New York or in any other of the other states?
Sure, of course. So New York has right now 200,000 confirmed corona cases, over 200,000, and about 10,000 deaths. California, despite being such a large state, has only about 22,500 confirmed cases and only about 700 deaths. So very stark contrast in numbers. New York was a little bit delayed in instituting. New York was the first to be the first case of confirmed coronavirus case in the United States. And so the way it sort of hit was it hit New York and then spread west towards California. And so it's also by virtue of time, that's why we're seeing New York have a lot more cases. But California was very diligent, and in early March, Governor Gavin Newsom proclaimed a state of emergency to exist in California. And by mid-March, he had declared, he had ordered all Californians to stay at home as much as possible until further notice. Again, similarly to Austria, restaurants, bars, entertainment venues, gyms were all closed. Most corporate offices were closed. Essential businesses remained open, like pharmacies, banks, grocery stores. Schools were also converted to distance learning. So the early action in California really made a difference in reducing the numbers and flattening.
Yeah. So you believe that the approach is different in California than, for example, in New York and other states, and therefore also the outcome is different. What strikes me in this is when this whole crisis started to be debated here in Europe, one of the factors that were very early taken into consideration when thinking about different measures to take were lessons learned from the Spanish flu in the early 20th century, where US states had a very, very different approach in the early phase of the pandemic event then, with dramatically different outcomes. So I remember several articles and TV shows and so on drawing a distinction between state A and B, how they be in the US, how they behaved in when the Spanish flu was the problem, and how dramatically different the death rate was. And I would expect from a European point of view that 100 years later, a state like the US has learned the lesson that it's probably a good idea to find one approach, which is hopefully the right one, and then apply it to the whole country. But that's not happening as far as I see it. And there are two questions for me on this. The first one is why? And second, is there any debate on this at the moment? So does, for example, the New York government feel any significant pressure for being too late or too weak in comparison with what's happening in California? Because the people at the same time constantly move around the different states during their careers and their lifetime. So it's rather random where you are when such a crisis occurs. And that looks weird to me. Could you help me in
Sure.
this?
Yeah, you would think that the US would have learned its lesson. So I have a two-part answer. First, this is dependent. The non-unified approach is by virtue of the fact that we have a federal system, and I'll get into that in a second. Second, I don't really mean to imply that New York was late, as it were, but because New York was the first hit and is so densely populated, what happened with New York is, well, California had the benefit of hindsight, right? So what happened with New York is it was hit very quickly. It didn't have enough resources. There was no national declaration of emergency at the time. And so it didn't have the ability to allocate funds that were needed to buy ventilators, to buy test kits, which at that point, when the first case hit New York, I don't think that the FDA had even approved a testing for corona at that point. I may be wrong about that, don't quote me on this, but I think it hadn't been issued yet. So that was what New York was suffering from, and the governor Cuomo asked the federal government multiple times for help in trying to consolidate and have a unified response to the virus. But so that took until about mid-March.
So, and that would be the task of the government, of the federal government. So it couldn't be, I mean, Austria has a federal system as well. And I mean, there are Landeshauptleute, as they are called,
right.
so the heads of the 9 different states or regions. But when there is a national crisis like this one, nobody in the whole country would understand that Burgenland has a different policy from Niederösterreich or Lower Austria. So it would be very clear that, and it is actually very clear at the moment, that we need one approach, and that we can certainly discuss about whether that is a useful approach, but there would not be a difference. Whereas Germany is different in this, but even in Germany now, I think the overall approach is quite clear, which is, as far as I see it, not really the case yet in the US. And I really have troubles in understanding this, because as I said, I mean, it's not only that it's a federal system, then it's more than just having a federal system, right?
Agreed. Yeah. So as now that we're speaking, I think there are stay-at-home measures orders issued in all 50 states at this point. Of course, each state took a different amount of time to come to that conclusion that a state of emergency needed to be declared, and that stay-at-home orders needed to be issued. I don't know about all 50 states' different policies and different measures and different orders. What I do know is that, of course, they acted on very different timescales. And as we alluded to earlier, each of the 50 states has a different political atmosphere, different cultural values. So all of that is reflected in how the states respond. The federal system is very different in the US, right? Because, and stop me if I'm kind of getting ahead, but under our federalist constitutional system, the police powers, which is the source of the government's ability to issue quarantine orders, primarily resides with the states and not the national government. So under the Constitution, in order for the federal government to act, there has to be either an implied or an explicit enumerated power. And the source of that would be the Constitution itself.
So I mean, I followed a little bit of the debate about how Trump behaves at the moment and what he is arguing. So what, in your view, from a legal perspective, would have been the role of the president at the beginning of the crisis? So when New York was hit, what was he supposed, or what were the options he would have had then, and what would have been the expectations he would have needed to meet?
Right. So ideally, President Trump should have issued a declaration of national emergency before the first case had hit New York, because he knew what Europe was going through already, and he did have the benefit of hindsight at that point. It was inevitable that COVID would spread to the US. It was just a matter of time. So what a declaration of national emergency does is it enables the federal government to allocate funds, FEMA funds, to help the states, and to help the states, for example, and does a lot of things. To get medical resources, including testing kits, including supplies. It assists the federal government in waiving certain Medicaid provisions, several other things. Of course, for the federal government to act, it is unable to touch within states, right? So the federal government's power basically is to stop and control the spread of disease between states and from coming into the US, as opposed to within states themselves.
Yeah, but a more harmonized approach to quarantine measures, for example, would not have been the outcome of this then?
Well, if he had declared a state of emergency at that point, I think it would have, just from a not from a legal perspective, but from a harmonized, from a cultural perspective, right? It would have encouraged states to maybe wake up a little bit earlier and say, look, maybe we need to issue stay-at-home orders. But it would have, so the short answer is no, it would not have necessarily affected whether each state issued stay-home orders.
Mm-hmm.
What it would have done is it would have controlled and slowed the spread of the disease a lot quicker. So the outcomes of states like New York could have been significantly different had the federal government acted sooner.
Mm-hmm. And how often does a US president declare the state of emergency? So are there any examples of catastrophic events where that happened?
I should know this. I don't know the last time the federal government declared a state of emergency. I think it's been quite a long time since the federal government issued any sort of.
So it's not something which happens every 10 years. So it's something where Trump probably was in the situation to consider carefully to do this or not to do this, because there were probably not too many examples available, right? Not too many role models to take.
Yes, that's sure.
Yeah. Okay, so did he declare a state of emergency now? No, not. I mean, yes, in a way, but late, right? That is the status. Yeah. And the outcome of this is now that funds are distributed more on a who needs the money basis than what is the actual normal way of distributing the money, right? So it's
right
about the funds. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it allows the federal government to tap into emergency funds. That's just one aspect of one consequence of the declaration of emergency. So it's not quite as critical as declaration of a state of emergency is not quite as critical as it would be, for example, in Poland. And there are several different players in the US that it's not the same thing. So as in Europe. So in the US, the Secretary of Health and Human Services declared a state of emergency under Section 319 of the Public Health Services Act on January 31st. The federal government did not issue a proclamation declaring COVID a national emergency until March 13th. So that's quite a big spread. The consequence of the Secretary of Health issuing the declaration of public emergency is that it gives legal authority for the Department of Health and Human Services to respond to the emergency, including permitting emergency triggering emergency powers that permit the federal government to engage in activities like quarantine orders, suspending or modifying legal requirements under Medicaid and Medicare, expending available funds under emergency funding sources. So the federal government's issuing proclamation happened on the 13th of March, and let's see, so that happened under Section 201 and 301 of the National Emergencies Act.
Yeah. So I mean, 13th of March is late when you put it in comparison with 31st of January, but when you compare it with European countries, it's not that late, right? So Austria, for example, reacted quite in the same time frame than in mid-March. However, the outcome of I mean, probably you can't really compare this because the wave behaves very differently in the US and in Austria or in Europe as a whole. But still, I mean, one thing that is really striking when we look into the US and in particular to New York from a European perspective is the extremely high death rate and how chaotic the situation looks, at least from the outside, in comparison with what we see in some of the European countries. So it looks very much like Italy or Spain, although it's clearly later than Italy and Spain. And my question to you would be whether you have any explanation, or whether there are any explanations why the situation is so bad at the moment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. Again, this is really speculative, but one is population density. That's probably one of the reasons why New York was hit so much harder. And another really critical one is the level of preparedness of the healthcare system in the US. As you know, we don't really have a national healthcare system that is consistent. Most insurances are privatized. The way that hospitals work and the way that healthcare works is very, very different in the United States.
Yeah. So if I may, population density, I think that's of course a factor, but I don't think that it can be too decisive, because Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea are also very, very densely populated areas of the world, and still they do remarkably better than the US. So the approach that it might have more to do with the health system might perhaps be have some plausibility. But so is there any debate again on in how far I mean, every American I ever spoke to, all of them constantly reply that the health system is broke. I mean, it's something that you really need to redo from scratch if you want to do that. And still, I don't see any real change in this. So do you think that Corona will now finally bring the momentum to change the system fundamentally?
I wish that I could say that I thought that were the case. Unfortunately, I don't, and it's probably more of a question of political will and the power of lobbyists, right? The healthcare industry in the US is incredibly profitable. And I'm not trying to vilify all of the players, but there are very, very strong economic interests and very strong, a very strong lobbying groups that would not want to see that happen.
Yeah, sorry, but if I may, I mean, I know that I'm completely naive in this, but still, if I may, I mean, if you have facts and figures, like the US is, I think, the only country in the Western part of this world where the average life expectation is decreasing. You have a country where a health crisis like Corona produces a catastrophic outcome when it comes to death rates. You have a country where you have millions of people who don't have any health insurance at all, not being able to afford any care, and therefore being high risk factors in such an epidemic situation at the moment, because they will try to hide that they are sick until the very end. And all this, and then the explanation that everything remains like it is just because the lobbying industry is so powerful. I mean,
I mean, it's it's a multitude of factors, right? But primarily, it's the political will needs to exist on a wide basis for something like this to happen. And people are not very informed about alternatives because they're unaware of what a national healthcare system would look like. Even Obamacare faced such wide opposition. And as you know, there was a Supreme Court case about it, a really interesting one. And again, I should know more about sort of the, I don't remember quite.
We can put it into the show notes.
The challenges were, but essentially it had to be declared almost as a tax, right? In order for this to be constitutional. Because as we kind of talked about, we alluded to earlier, because of the federalist system, it's a lot more difficult for the US to act under its federal power to institute a national insurance company, for example, right? But yes, it is a small wonder why the US, such a powerful and relatively rich country, has such a broken healthcare system. It's very unfortunate, and it's unfortunate that there's not enough voters that want to see a change.
Okay, so if I may, please excuse me if I'm not diplomatic enough and unpolite here. Sorry, no offense. Okay, but I mean, one of the commentaries that I read, I think a week ago or so, that I found rather interesting was that this crisis, this global crisis at the moment, is the end point of the phase in which the US, in a way, has a kind of cultural hegemony on this globe, because no longer anybody in the world expects the US to solve the problem. And on the contrary, the US is one of those who have the most significant issues to deal with at the moment, and that everybody looks into how Asian countries such as, I mean, China is a specific case, but you don't need to go into China. You can also look into South Korea, which is a democracy, or you can, even Japan would be an example, an interesting example. People here in Europe probably study a little bit more in detail. Nobody looks into what the US is doing to learn anything. So is this something the country feels, and is there any debate on this? So or
I mean, I can only speak about, anecdotally. My parents are Greek immigrants, and so they have, of course, most of our extended family is in Greece still. So they've kept tabs on what's going on in Europe, of course. And, they are a special class of people. They're what I guess would be termed in the US kind of the intellectual elite. So they are, of course, aware of the fact that Europe and Asia has been much more diligent in responding to COVID, and of course that the US has lost a great opportunity to show its unity and leadership in responding to the disease. But whether the entire US feels this way, I don't think so. I think, again, it's really dependent on which states you look at and the level of education that each individual that you look at has, because the US is unfortunately has such a great spread of both educational levels and political bents, and to the extent that they're even aware of what's happening in Europe is dependent on what kind of social and cultural groups they belong to.
Do you think that and if so, which outcome or impact the outcome of this whole crisis will be on the election, will have on the election of the next president? So...
Well, at the expense of showing kind of my politics, I don't have a prediction, because last time I tried to predict, I was sorely mistaken. I think everybody was very surprised at the last election results, but with respect to this election, I hope that we see a non-re-election of President Trump. I mean, yesterday you saw him declare that he had total authority. It's become a little bit of a game show kind of. If you look at the news, it's almost as if you're watching an SNL episode as opposed to MSNBC.
Yeah, but I mean, if I may, with all due respect, this is no news for a European, because since he has been in power, for many of the things that he has done and that he has said are strikingly strange from a European perspective, to put it in diplomatic terms. But I mean, the question I would have would be whether you think that I mean, if I get you correctly now at the moment, what you're saying is that it doesn't have any impact on the probable outcome of the elections, that you do hope that it will have some, but you are doubtful that it would.
I mean, I don't know. I think his behavior has been so so unreasonable, and so at least his public proclamation and actions have been so off base and so out of touch with reality that I'm hoping that will be seen by the American public, and that they'll respond accordingly. I hate to make predictions just because I was so surprised at the last election, as the US.
Of course. But perhaps something which is not a prediction, but something which is about the situation at the moment. Do you have the feeling that, I mean, the position he has at the moment, or the the support he has at the moment suffers from the crisis, or is he? I mean, in Europe we see that governments take a lot of profit out of the situation. So the Austrian government, for example, has, I don't know, probably more than 60 or even 70% of support at the moment in the population, I would think. So if there were elections today, both parties in power at the moment would strongly win.
Yeah.
And the situation is, as far as I see it, quite similar in many other countries. So how would you put this in the US? Do you think that he takes profit, or does he lose at the moment? Right now in the situation?
I mean, I haven't looked at poll numbers. So again, this would be from a purely speculative point of view and from my own assessment of the situation. But in general, I think that he would not be getting any popularity points at this point. That is quite the opposite to specific state governors. For example, Gavin Newsom, right, and Cuomo have shown that, you know, they've been responsive, they've been requesting federal assistance, they've been even promised. So Cuomo, for example, promised that if other states would help him acquire ventilators that were necessary to treat patients that were in New York, that he would return those ventilators to other states. First, he would personally see to that once New York's curve had flattened out. That's not the case with President Trump. He has not been responding with any sort of a decisive or early actions that could have saved thousands of lives. And as a result, I really don't think he's gaining any popularity points at the moment. No.
Okay, so when you talk about the ventilators, I mean, one of the assets that the US clearly has, of course, is that they have world-leading industry when it comes to information technology and also in some areas of medical research. The US is really still a world leader as far as I see it. So how do you see, how would you assess what's happening in this area? So for example, when it comes to the technology companies, how important is their input at the moment? How innovative are research initiatives that try to find vaccines and so on? Is there anything you can report that is gives a little bit of hope, perhaps? Or
I know there has been an initiative by Google to work with Apple to enable certain applications that would potentially track whether you're coming into contact with or track your movements and see whether you're coming into contact with people who've been exposed to COVID or people who've tested positive. That's sort of a California specific initiative. Despite President Trump's declarations to the contrary. I'm not aware of other initiatives that are happening in the field of medical research. Yeah, I do know that the FDA's approved test for COVID was actually quite delayed as compared to Europe. I heard something along the lines of, again, I haven't researched this in detail, but I think the German test was approved much earlier and was actually much more effective than the US's initial attempt at a COVID test. So.
So this initiative from Apple and Google that you mentioned was presented, I think, last Friday. And what they said was that they would offer this possibility to allow cross-platform functionality on Android and iOS devices would be ready to use for governments and for government certified apps later in May, so in 4 weeks or so. And of course, that draws a lot of attention in many of the European governments. I have a little bit of an overview on, but you tell me now that even this is not really closely monitored by all 50 states?
Yeah, my understanding is that this is a sort of test case that Google was preparing for California mostly. I don't know whether those companies are planning to roll that out nationally. I think it would be a voluntary app, right? Of course, it wouldn't be a
yeah. They put a lot of emphasis on freedom of decision in this, so it's not compulsory.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Culturally speaking, do you think that, I mean, would it be, I mean, you said in preparation of this talk that you don't think that it would be legal in the US to introduce such an app on a compulsory level, which I take as a message. But when it comes to a voluntary solution, do you think that the general public would support the usage of such apps?
Again, this is probably a question that's going to break down. It's going to be very dependent. I'm sorry for that. Very dependent on each state. And my understanding is that I think California and probably the East Coast states would support such a measure. I don't know what the cultural climate would be really in Middle America. I think California obviously is a lot of its population is very tech savvy. They're really used to Fitbit and Amazon and ordering their groceries online, and so it's sort of perceived as a much less invasive measure. Their willingness to part with some measure of their privacy for convenience or for safety in this case, I think is much higher than it would be in, say, North South Dakota or perhaps Arizona. So yeah, it really depends on where in the US we're talking about.
So that, I mean, if I may, it strikes me really because the feeling that I have when I listen to you is that we are not talking about one country. We are talking about, I mean, we are talking about many different ones, geographically, economically, socially, politically, legally. So the whole united in the United States of America is disappearing in a way, at least in my feeling. Would you support that interpretation?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think what the US kind of perceives, or what Europe, I'm sorry, kind of perceives as the US is essentially the East Coast and California. A lot of Middle America is very different culturally, right? And the South, let's not forget the South. They're different worlds, and both geographically, culturally, economically, in every sense of the word. In California, you have Silicon Valley, and you have Hollywood. In New York, of course, you have Wall Street, and then you have a lot of prairie land and a lot of, I'm not trying to. Of course, my home state is originally Illinois, but I'm not trying to say anything negative about the middle of the US, but it's not seen on a global scale the way that California and the East Coast.
May I then perhaps, just to slowly find an end to this, so perhaps if you have any questions in the audience, please let us ask. Let me show them to me so I could ask them. There's one question here, and then I will ask one or two final questions, but there's one question here, which is the Swedish corona death rate, or even the UK death rate, is way worse than the US death rate. That's true. That's more a comment than a question. True, but still the death rate, in particular in New York, is, as far as I understand it, quite high. Let's put it like this, right? And the pressure in the political system, and in particular in those areas of the US where the death rate is high, is intense. Perhaps, so please ask questions if you have any. If not, I do have one, two, three. One more precise now, perhaps also about the legal system. So is there any debate on a federal level at the moment ongoing how the legal system needs to respond at the moment on an emergency level, I mean. So because, for example, in Austria, as you know, there have been quite some initiatives in the parliament, 5 different laws now, all of them specifically dealing with the corona crisis. Is there a similar debate and tendency in the US on a federal level and or on a state level? Or is all this happening within the already existing regime because it's not a civil law system?
So do you mean debates on the function of the court system and
unemployment, for example, right? So there is quite a lot of debate and quite a lot of money invested at the moment in Europe, and you need a legal basis for this.
Yeah.
And therefore you need quite a lot of laws clarifying that unemployment rules should be different than normal in the moment, right?
Yeah.
And there's quite a lot of activity in this, but without really closely monitoring this, I don't read too much about this from the US. And my question is now, am I not reading the right sources, or is it not happening?
No, so the US does have broad authority to, are we talking just economically? I mean, from an economic response perspective, the Commerce Clause gives them broad sweeping powers to come up with a rescue package, right? Which they've allocated, I think already, it's something along the lines of 2 trillion, some obnoxious number. That's, for unemployment benefits, for help in treatment and the waiving of co-pays for testing and treatment. I think they were just in discussions with the airline industry yesterday. So there has been a response in terms of an economic rescue package.
Yeah. But that doesn't need any legal initiative because the umbrella is already here. So you don't need to change anything in the legal system.
Right. No. It would just be President Trump essentially approving and signing a bill. And I think that this is a little bit less of a political issue because everybody recognizes the fact that a rescue package needs to be put together at this point.
But unemployment rates, for example, really exploded, right? So it's a dramatic situation at the moment, also when it comes to this. Okay. Any other legal initiatives that you are aware of that are worth being reported?
No, I don't believe so. We talked a little bit about California soon reopening, and Governor Gavin Newsom warned about a second wave potentially hitting California. So maybe we'll see what happens with that. Maybe actually that'll be an interesting test case, not hopefully not in a tragic way for other states. But again, schools will remain closed for the rest of the year. So we'll see how California fares.
Okay. It's a little bit depressing where we are. So at least my feeling at the moment is a little bit more depressed than an hour ago. But I appreciate a lot that you take the time and that you are so open in how you perceive the situation. Katharina, is there anything I should have asked, or is there anything you want to add at the moment?
No, it was a real pleasure. Thank you for speaking with me. I hope things in the US improve soon for all of our sakes.
Yes, that's what all of us, of course, hope. So good. So then no additional questions. Thank you, Katharina, again for taking the time. We really appreciate that you are with us in Europe and that you are here in Austria and with us in the department. Thank you to all the listeners out there. We appreciate your presence. Please stay with us. There will be another session of this tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. with one of the leading figures in the German debate, Nico Herting, about constitutional rights, fundamental rights, and the situation in Germany. Thank you for joining. Hope to see you soon. Please stay healthy and stay safe. All the best to all of you. Goodbye.
Thank you.